I was born in Dayton, Ohio, but at the age of 3 months, my parents took me to Sierra Leone, West Africa, where my father was assistant principal of a teacher's training school. We had a very interesting trip. Well, actually, we took two trips. The first trip I don't remember much because it was from baby to the age of 3, but the second time we went back was in 1944, so the war was still on. And when it came time to catch the train to go to Florida, where we would get on the plane, they had a heavy snowstorm in Ohio, and we couldn't get out. We were snowbound, so all the neighbors got together and dug by hand about half a mile to the highway so we could get out. And we got on the train and started south. One incident that happened on the way, it was either Alabama or Georgia, I don't remember now. The train stopped and a black woman got on, and she sat down in a white car. And the train started up. The conductor came through and saw her there and said she had to go to a black car. She refused to go, and so the train stopped, and they kicked her off the train out in the middle of the wilderness. And I was only 7 years old, so that made quite an impression on me and had a major influence on me later in life. Well, we got on the plane. It was an old airplane, B-59, and it developed plane trouble, so they dropped us off in Brazil at an army base at Natal, Brazil, and they said, we have to go back to the U.S. to get the plane fixed, and then we will come back and pick you up. On the way back, the plane crashed. Everybody on board was killed. And since it was during the war, they couldn't find another plane, so we stayed in Brazil for 2 months. Finally, a plane came and picked us up and took us to Dakar, Senegal, and dropped us off, but we still had to go down the coast to Sierra Leone. And we had to do this without being seen. So we traveled in a dugout canoe out in the open ocean. It had about 6 oarsmen. And I remember we all got pretty sick because the waves were big. We couldn't use any lights because we were afraid the Germans would bomb us. We finally reached Sierra Leone, and they dropped us off on the coast. And then I and my brother, who was younger, 4 years younger, were carried on the backs of porters, and my parents walked. We had quite a trip into the jungle. I remember we would stop at night at a village. I remember one village, the chief said, all right, we'll put you up in the guest village, in the guest house. And he went in and chased all the chickens off the bed. And by the next morning, we were all covered with lice. And it was a terrible time because we couldn't get rid of the lice. But we finally reached where we were going, which was Bunumbu. At the end of the road, it was back in the jungle. Beyond our house, there was a river, and then forest and mountains, and that was all. But I loved it. My mother taught me, so I did studies only in the morning, and then in the afternoon I was free to play. I had lots of pets, including monkeys and guinea pigs and things like that. And I really loved Sierra Leone. And this is where I developed a love of nature, which has continued to this day. In fact, was instrumental in my coming to Canada to take a job later on. When we came back to Ohio after spending 3 years in Sierra Leone again, I was 10 years old. My father was a minister, and he had a church in a little town called Woodville, Ohio. And then a sister came along later, so we had 3 in my family. The town was small, was only 2,000 people. And I had a lot of trouble adjusting to U.S. culture. I hated living in the U.S. I just wanted to go back to Sierra Leone. Yeah, but it was a long time before I could do that. When I was in high school, I had to work very hard to save money to go to college because my father was not making very much money as a minister. So I worked on the Ohio Turnpike, carrying plywood for carpenters who were building bridges over the turnpike. And that was pretty scary because there were the metal beams were 8 feet apart, spanning the highway with a cement concrete pavement below, and I had to go out on those beam and carry a 4x8 sheet of plywood out to a carpenter. So if the wind came along, I would just let the plywood go because it was too dangerous. I also worked in a lime factory, and I didn't like that too well because I was coughing half the time. In any case, I made it through high school and went on to the University of Indianapolis in Indiana, and I ran through my high school savings in the first year, and so I had to work the last 3 years. I worked 40 hours a week, and I was editor of the college newspaper, so I was very busy attending classes and working and running the newspaper. My 2 best professors were a sociology professor and a philosophy professor. They made quite an impact on my life. When I was a senior, I won a Danforth Fellowship, which was the first awarded to my college, and I decided to use it to go to Yale to study religion. It was basically a continuation of my academic interests in philosophy and sociology in college. I found going to Yale was pretty tough because I was coming, first of all, from a very small high school with only 18 people in my class, and then a small college. And here I was competing with first-rate minds and wonderful professors, but it was difficult till I got the hang of it. I soon discovered that I was more interested in why people are religious than in religion itself. And so I elected to do anthropology as a minor. So I did religion as my major and anthropology as a minor. And I was privileged to take some first-rate anthropology courses at Yale, anthropology of art, archaeology, an interesting course on the Kula Ring with Professor Davenport, and so forth. The most influential theologian on my thinking at the time was Paul Tillich at Harvard. I heard him speak on one occasion. I also heard Martin Luther King speak, who came to Yale, and President John Kennedy spoke at my graduation ceremony. It may be hard to believe, but Connecticut was racially segregated. New Haven was segregated, and so I took part in demonstrations. We would go occupy seats at the restaurants so other people couldn't sit down, line up at banks to take out 5 cents, that sort of thing, using the techniques that Martin Luther King had advocated. And I remember getting my picture in the newspaper. The police came and were about to arrest all of us. We didn't actually get arrested, but when the picture appeared in the paper, they had put something over my eyes so I wouldn't be recognized. I didn't actually go south, but many of my classmates went down south to take part in the demonstrations under the leadership of Martin Luther King. Well, after 3 years, I graduated from Yale, and I was tired of school, and so I and a friend went to France and bought bicycles, and we bicycled across Europe, and we ended up in Germany, Nuremberg, where we met one of our friends from Yale, who was actually the Minister of Finance for Afghanistan. And so he bought a Volkswagen bus, and we took the bus through Greece and Turkey and out across the desert. In those days, that was 1962, there weren't any roads past Ankara, Turkey. And so we had adventures along the way, which I won't go into, but some of them kind of scary. Since there weren't any roads, we didn't know where we were part of the time. Part of the time we didn't have any food. We traveled at night because it was cooler. And I remember one particular scene I remember very clearly was a medieval walled city that was deserted, but the sun came up and was shining, reflecting off these walls, and there were wild camels in the desert. One scary incident, we were on a mountain pass, and we passed a truckload of men who were riding the back of the truck, and we raised dust, and they didn't like that. So they came after us with the truck and passed us and sideswiped us and sent us over the edge. And fortunately, the driver of the bus was able to turn the wheel, so we went down straight forward rather than rolling. But the vehicle was pretty badly damaged, so we had to tie the door back on, and we couldn't get that fixed until we got to Tehran. When we got to the Iranian border, the border guard looked at our visas, and he said, "Well, your visas are in order, but where is your letter of permission from the Shah?" We said, "Well, we never heard of anything like that." And he said, "Well, you see these cars here? These people had to take a bus, take a 3-day trip to Tehran to get their letter." And so our friend, who was the Minister of Finance from Afghanistan, he took out his billfold, took out money, and handed it to the border guard, and the guard said, "You just got your personal letter of invitation from the Shah of Iran." So we finally made it to Kabul, and it was at a time when they were celebrating their independence. It was quite colorful. We got to see the king in a parade, and the people came in from all over Afghanistan to sell their handicrafts. Very interesting. Almost no vehicles in the city except trucks and taxis. My friend then went back to the States, and I took a plane to India and visited the holy sites of particularly of Buddhism and Hinduism. While I was at Yale, I had pretty much decided I was more interested in Zen than I was in Christian religion, and so I wanted to go to Japan to find out more about Zen. So from India, I went to Hong Kong and Taiwan, and then to Japan, where I had lined up a job teaching English. So I taught there for a year at Doshisha High School in Kyoto, and that's where I met my wife in 1963. This was a very influential year for me. I found no culture shock in going to Japan. I felt more at home there than I did in the United States. And I continued my interest in Zen and studied with some Zen teachers. At the end of my stay in Kyoto, I was awarded an East-West Center fellowship to do my MA in Asian Studies at the East-West Center at the University of Hawaii. So I went off to Hawaii, and my wife Michiko stayed in Japan to finish college. And I specialized in Japan and did my MA thesis on the concept and development of the concept of shibusa in Japan. Shibusa is a very complex concept which tries to walk a fine line between austerity and spontaneity. And it's very difficult to describe. Literally, shibusa means the puckery taste of an unripe persimmon. And it has that kind of austerity, but at the same time, it's supposed to be refined and have some spontaneity to it. So I found this a very interesting topic, so I did my MA thesis on that. I was also a co-editor of the East-West Center newspaper, like I had done in college. I found learning Japanese very difficult for me. I was never very good at languages, so I made it to the beach only twice during my 2 years at the University of Hawaii. Now, after I finished the MA at the University of Hawaii, my Danforth Fellowship that I had received at the end of my college career kicked back in. And so I went on to do my PhD dissertation at Stanford. Actually, first I was accepted at the University of Chicago with sole tax, offering to have me work with him as an assistant on his journal, Current Anthropology. But when I looked at the Stanford catalog and saw all those palm trees on the cover, reminded me of Sierra Leone, which I still loved. And I said, I don't want to go to windy Chicago. And so I accepted position at Stanford University instead. So Michiko and I arrived in Palo Alto. We only had $15 to live on for a month until the scholarship started. So we went out and bought a couple loaves of bread, a big jar of peanut butter, and some little packets of dried soup that cost 5 cents a piece. And we made it through until the scholarship started. So I found Stanford much more to my liking than Yale. Stanford was much more informal. For example, at Yale, one incident, we had a requirement, we had to wear ties to the meals. So I didn't like wearing a tie, so one day I wore a turtleneck sweater. And I got to the door, and the guy said, pull down your sweater so I can see. And I pulled it down, and I didn't have a tie, and he wouldn't let me in. Well, something like that would have been ridiculous at Stanford, which was much more relaxed. My thesis advisor was Hirumi Befu, a Japanese scholar, and he gave me free rein to do whatever I wanted to do with my dissertation. Before I could start specializing, however, I did field work in Santa Maria Zompa in Mexico near the Guatemalan border. It was a pottery making village. And this was really a test case to see which members of our first year class were suited to be anthropologists. So they took us all out to the edge of villages and dropped us off, and they said, go find a place to live and do your study. So I walked into town, not having met anybody, no introductions. I knew a little Spanish, but I found I couldn't use it because this happened to be a Zapotec village. So I went up to the first door I found and knocked on the door, and the old lady came, and I had quite a bit of trouble telling her I wanted to live at her house. She thought I was crazy. And she finally understood, and she said, well, I'd have to wait until her son, Roberto, came back. He was working as a guard at Monte Alban, which is an old archaeological site nearby. He finally came back. First he said, absolutely not. He said, the only place we have room to put you is in my bedroom, and I just got married. And so I didn't give up. And I told him, I said, I have in Oaxaca, where we went on the weekends for courses to discuss what we had learned during the week. I said, in Oaxaca, I have a Volkswagen that I drove down here from California. If you let me stay with you, I'll teach you to drive the Volkswagen. So he thought that over and decided he would let me stay. So he strung up a big curtain dividing his room in half, and I slept on the floor. He slept in a bed with his new wife, which is the only piece of furniture that I saw in town the whole time I was there. And I was a little worried because the scorpions would scuttle across my sleeping bag at night, but I never got bit. But a scorpion dropped out of the ceiling one night and bit Roberto in his bed. Fortunately, the South American or Mexican scorpions aren't that poisonous, so it wasn't a major problem. I think even worse was the fact there was no bathroom, and I was sick most of the time from the food, and so I just have to go out and squat outside and fight off the dogs. And the other tough thing about field work was we ate about breakfast 4 o'clock in the morning, and then we ate again at noon, and that was the last meal of the day. And the only food was for both meals was a couple of tortillas and some refried beans. And so I was so hungry for vegetables and for some meat. But I made it through. About half the people who went down dropped out and decided they didn't want to be anthropologists after all. So, but I made it through, and went back to Stanford, did my coursework, passed the comprehensives, and then went off to Japan, where I studied 1 year in Kyoto, studied Japanese for 1 year in Kyoto at the Inter-University Center on a Fulbright Hays Fellowship. Then that year was followed by 6 months of fieldwork in Tokyo, and then 6 months of fieldwork in a northern community in Japan. I did my dissertation on color preferences in Japan and how color preferences are related to personality and culture. I found that colors carry meanings. It's a type of language, and so people could wear colors to express their status, or their clothing had to be appropriate to their age and gender. One day we went by a house where we saw men's underwear hanging out on the line, but it was bright red. And never saw men in Japan wear anything like that. So we asked the man, we said, well, what's the story on this bright red underwear? And he said, well, red is actually my favorite color, but I, of course, can't wear it outside. But if I wear it under my clothes, it's okay. So this is who I really am. So finished up the research. We had to hire an assistant in northern Japan because the dialect was so strong, even my wife couldn't understand. But we collected a lot of data and went back to Stanford to write it up. And this involved a lot of computer work. So we spent most of our life in the back of a truck in a little camper at the computer center. Those were the days when you had cards, and you'd run through like 6,000 cards, and if there was one mistake, you'd have to start all over again. So it took forever. But I did learn something about computer use. In fact, when I completed the degree, I was offered a job with the World Health Center in Switzerland doing epidemiological fieldwork. But I was tired of moving around and wanted a steady job. And so I didn't take that job. I went to University of Alberta in Edmonton instead. In these early days, I was most impressed by early ethnographers such as Raymond Firth, Ruth Benedict, and Gregory Bateson. Those are the three who had the most impact on me. I was privileged to hear Gregory Bateson speak at Stanford, and I borrowed some of his concepts when I later did fieldwork with Native people in Canada. I'll mention that a little bit later. This was a time of considerable intellectual excitement at Stanford and in other places. We spent a lot of time debating the merits of structuralism and functionalism, whether anthropology is really a science, whether cultural relativism is justified, or whether anthropologists should be willing to take a stance on topics, this sort of thing. When I finished my PhD at Stanford, I was offered some jobs in the U.S., but I was offered also a job at University of Alberta. As I mentioned, having lived in Sierra Leone, I developed this keen love of nature. The jobs in the U.S. were in cities, industrialized cities, and I didn't like the places I visited, so I went to give a talk at the University of Alberta, and eventually took a job there. I was opposed by a strong Marxist faction, which wanted to turn the department into a Marxist department, and they didn't want a psychological anthropologist. And so the leader of that faction told me he was going to do everything he could to get rid of me. So it wasn't a very good welcome. But I was on the supervisory committee of most of the Marxist students, and I found them to be excellent students. In fact, they taught me a lot about Marxism. Later, another crisis came along with postmodernism. And I learned quite a bit from postmodernism as well, but I managed to maintain a holistic interest in anthropology, and did archaeological field work with Ruth and Alan Bryan down in Nevada. Also worked with an archaeologist, Rob Bonnickson, who was a Flint Knapper. He started the Center for the Study of the First Americans. And we worked together on trying to discover the production grammars behind the making of stone tools as a way of understanding stone tools in the archaeological record. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I also started the Center for the Cross-Cultural Study of Health and Healing at the University of Alberta. I found this very useful as a place to train graduate students in a research setting. Currently, I am supervising Cliff Pompana, who is a healer, Lakota healer, 72 years old, who is working on how the survivors of the residential schools use the sun dance as a healing device to help recover from their terrific experiences from the past.